This is Garden in Silver Moonlight, designed by Haruko Seki.
I got inspiration from viewing platform of Katsura Imperial Villa, which is the architectural masterpiece in 17th century, from where people are looking at the moon and reflected onto the pond. I describe my garden as contemporary Japanese garden, which is based on traditional concept of Japanese. If you start the journey from the carving path on right-hand side, you are walking through the silver grass up to the hill and then going to bamboo. Just before reaching to the viewing platform, which is highest point of the garden, the view will be totally blocked. And then suddenly you have an open view onto the pond. This is the first journey. If you go down to the carving path left-hand side, you will go through the dark cypress trees, and then you have second platform, which is a little bit small, and then this stepping stone, which leads you and also control your steps. 120 bamboo canes control your view. And try to create a kind of atmosphere in the bamboo trunk, which is very common scenery in Japan. Bamboo grows up to 20 meters. We have breathing noise, the movement, and also upright structure to the garden. The most important tree in this garden is a specimen tree, just right-hand side in front of the garden. The color scheme overall in this garden is silver gray, like everything turned into the silver gray under the moonlight. Planting scheme on the right-hand side, when you go up to the hill, I chose some ornamental grass with a subtle fine texture, having subtle movement by the wind. There is a moon, which is made of grass and lighting up from the bottom of the pond. And also you can see ceramic sculpture close to the moon. It looks like cloud in the sky. Anything I produce is based on Japanese sense, but it's a kind of mixture. I incorporate Western style. I would say my style is contemporary Japanese, but Western culture is also integrated. The garden has also been created for a kind of celebration for the friendship or diplomacy between UK and Japan.
To vote for Garden in Silver Moonlight, go to the BBC website, bbc.co.uk/Chelsea.
Now, if Thursday is the day we look at trends established at Chelsea this year, then one of the most striking things is how many gardens have been embraced an Eastern flavour. London-based designer Haruko Seki recently returned to her native Japan to interpret the essence of Japanese tradition for a modern garden. Our reporter Wesley Kerr travelled with her.
I was born in Tokyo, but have lived in the UK for the past 10 years. Every time I go back to Japan, I rediscover Japanese culture and its uniqueness, especially in traditional Japanese gardens.
Kyoto is the heart of historic Japan. There are more than 2,000 temples and shrines here, many of them with outstandingly beautiful gardens. The Shorin Temple was built for the Buddhist monks of the Tendai sect. Part of its gardens were planned by one of Japan's most famous garden designers, Kobori Enshu, who was a favourite with the imperial family in the 17th century. The gardens here at Shoren Inn are both grand and intimate, imposing and delicate. But this tranquility, this sense of nature, is crafted. It's the product of a garden-making tradition that goes back thousands of years. The garden is an example of a traditional Japanese strolling garden where you follow a prescribed route. The path through the garden is marked by stepping stones set into the moss.
The view is totally controlled.
So it seems like a narrow path, but maybe there's a surprise in store.
Yeah.
Wow.
We have suddenly open view. This is something happened in Japanese garden. Just before reaching to the open view, the view has been blocked. And then you have some surprise.
And the surprise is almost like a perfect painting.
Yes.
Another important feature of Japanese gardens, ponds or even large lakes. During the day their function is ornamental, but at night they take on a new character by the light of the moon.
In old time we have a custom. In the full moon night, people sitting in the terrace, they're watching at the moon reflected into the pond. Initially, I was inspired by a line of poem written in Japanese. 月の住む川の内なる里なれば、桂の影はのどけかるらん。
Bamboo is a plant that grows wild all over Japan, and it's found in many traditional gardens, but it's also really popular in modern design.
I love using bamboo in my design. It has been used in traditional garden. Also still have huge potential in using contemporary garden and landscape were associated with contemporary architecture.
But what does a non-traditional Japanese garden look like? The gardens at the Tofukuji temple marked a dramatic change in garden design. They're the work of Mirei Shigemori, an immensely influential figure for contemporary designers. Shigemori laid them out in 1939 after fire had destroyed the old gardens. The epitome of Japanese design simplicity is the dry landscape gardens with their precisely raked stones and miniature mountains, which were first created by Zen Buddhists. Shigemori took those traditions, shook them up and made changes which were seen as radical and controversial. Shigemori topiarized plants into geometric patterns and formed a checkerboard of moss and paving stones. And rather than just using rocks, he placed stones that had been worked by hand.
It's easy to continue something successful in the past, but I'm trying to create something new, something very original.
Well, the moon shines on Haruko's garden even in the daytime because it's ensnared there in the middle of the pool with a light underneath it. She said what she wanted to do here was to evoke a traditional Japanese garden, but using non-traditional, modern materials. And indeed she has done. This polished limestone pathway seems to float over the surface of the water. And where in a Japanese garden you'd expect reeds, those are represented by these bamboo poles. I hope she doesn't mind me touching them like this. It's wonderful just to rattle them a bit and let them wobble. Then you look down here and you see this limestone path sweeping right the way round and capturing the moon at its centre. The plants are used quite sparsely. We've got wonderful feathery steeper grasses under there and a couple of wisterias hovering over the water. And these pleated, expanded fans of stone that come out into the pool are meant to be a metaphor for the passing of time. The thing about Japanese gardens that strikes you most forcibly is that they are so tightly controlled, and yet in the centre of them you feel an overwhelming feeling of serenity. Quite beautiful and very calming.
Here in Studio Lassu's garden, the greens evoke an entirely different response. The strong horizontal planes of the water are emphasised by a great carpet of sedum, and that's then picked up on this side of the path with a soft, billowing and sensuous, rather feminine, Stipa tenuissima. And then the real contrast kicks in. It's the thrust of Phyllis Stachys. The whole thing creates a very dynamic energy.
One of the most important features of this garden are the amazing and expensive trees.
It's a reference, isn't it, to the Japanese garden, which is quite interesting in what is a very Western garden.
Yeah, but in a Japanese garden, these kinds of trees have poise because they rise out of nothing, they look balanced, whereas this is sort of frothing around out of it all.
On the other hand, I think
It's a breather.
I think the foliage is actually very interesting, and I particularly like the use of the very different leaf shapes.
It's very nice to see the water actually more formal than its surroundings too. It's good.
Yeah. I think the tanks are really beautiful because they're very smooth, and you get wonderful reflections in the water, even with just a tiny tremble of the breeze. One suspects that it's probably going to come out as best in show. But for me, I think he's a wonderful plantsman. He's a great designer. There's just too much happening. But I think we should go on and look at some of the other gardens which have, for example, the Arabella Lennox Boyd garden, which uses water again, but by contrast is actually a very large space with almost nothing in it. This garden actually is a bit confusing to me because when I first saw it yesterday, I looked at it and thought, what a lovely space. But the more I've seen it, the less I actually like it because it has a huge use of space. But somehow it isn't sculpting that space.
The shape of the water lilies and the path work well, but I don't know how much you'd want to walk down them, do you?
But it isn't a real garden. It's, again, taking both Chinese and Japanese use of rocks, isn't it?
I actually want to take even more away, although this is a fairly minimal setup. I would actually lose the lilies, you know.
If you're going to be minimalist, then be minimalist. And when you get back to that planting back there, to me, that isn't really working. That's what you'd call frothy.
It's fussy, frothy, too much of it, and it's out of proportion because that's a fussy little end to an enormous big planar space.
The Japanese garden, the moon garden, gives us, I think, a much better impression of what you can do on a small scale.
Garden in the silver moonlight, what do you think?
It's lovely, wonderful.
I just think this is so simple and polished. I really do. It's almost all in one plane, and yet everything's done in reflection. Slight changes of surface level as you go around. It's beautiful.
Complexity without fussiness.
It is. And wherever you look, outside or inside this garden, there's a beautiful composition, and that is the great skill.
What I really like about it is these sculptures over here, for example. I mean, they look, they're cedar, they look a little bit, they have a sort of vague resemblance to sort of fish that you might find in a Japanese garden.
It's also interesting use of a very difficult site, I think.
It's real thinking about design, and that for me is really important in a garden.
Sometimes less is more, and sometimes less is less.
Which are you claiming this to be, Stephen?
This is less is more.